On this second Halloween special of Projector, Michael Fassbender stars in the latest adaptation of William Shakespeare's Scottish play, while Ethan Hawke uses regression therapy to try and uncover the crime committed to Emma Watson. Hello and welcome to Projector, and up first, Michael Fassbender stars in a new version of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Macbeth, played by Michael Fassbender, has been a loyal soldier to King Duncan of Scotland, played by David Thewlis, until he meets a group of mysterious witches that foretell that he will rise to power. Spurred on by his wife, played by Marion, Cotillard, Macbeth enacts a plot to betray his ruler and kill him. However, after he takes the throne, Macbeth becomes a violent tyrant, his mind decaying as he descends further into paranoia and suspicion. Macbeth is arguably one of Shakespeare's most well-known plays, but it's also one of his darkest and most violent, and when it comes to adapting it for the screen, you're up against some serious competition, given it's been previously adapted by Orson Welles, Akira Kurosawa for Throne of Blood, and most notoriously the Roman Polanski version, which is infamously violent, and was actually the version that I was most familiar with before this one, because it was used when I was studying the text at GCSE level. Now, when it comes to Shakespeare plays on screen, it's not so much about the actual text themselves, so much as what the directors bring to their adaptations, which makes them very interesting in terms of analysis. Now, this version of Macbeth, which is directed by Australian director Justin Kurzel, has some very small changes made to the start of the play that make some major impacts on how it plays out. In fact, in the very first scene, instead of the traditional witches opening, what we get is a scene with Macbeth and his wife grieving for their child at a funeral. And this informs their decisions for the rest of the film, because now they're a grieving family. And what the film is trying to do there is trying to imply that their actions later on in the film, where they try to overthrow Duncan and take the throne for themselves, is trying to make up for a loss in their own lives, and there's an emptiness, a void in that relationship. There's clearly a fracture going on between them because of their shared loss. That also informs another area of the film where Macbeth, and this is probably the element that's most geared towards modern sensibilities, Macbeth himself is given a slightly more empathetic reading by giving him PTSD, essentially, or at least what we would define as PTSD, in that he's a soldier who's gone through this horrific battle and he's been scarred by it. The opening battle sequence features him leading an army, many of whom are made up of very young boy soldiers because they've lost a lot of men fighting against their enemy, and Macbeth sees these boys being slaughtered, particularly one that he makes a major connection with, whose throat is slit. And tying that with the original opening scene there, where they're grieving over their lost child, you can tell that there's a surrogate relationship between the two there, and that the loss has clearly impacted on Macbeth in such a way that he's clearly not functioning properly even at the start of the film. I mean, when you talk about this movie, it's very visually interesting. Again, going back to the PTSD thing, what Kurzel does with the opening battle sequence is almost like 300 as an art film. It's almost not even technically a battle sequence as what you would define it. It's more of a montage set inside a battle, in that it will cross-cut between events and it almost seems very dislocated and out of place and completely lost, and it's meant to put us in the psyche of Macbeth's mind, in that he's completely shattered emotionally. You see this battle going on, but it will cut to Fassbender's Macbeth standing almost in the middle of it as it goes on around him, almost trance-like looking at the witches. Now that may sound like this is a very supernatural version of the play. Actually, this version tones it down significantly. And the witches themselves are not really pivotal characters, they're more almost like ominous spectres. And that's a very interesting interpretation of the play, but it also does something that I think gets the heart of this adaptation in that it tries to ground itself in some kind of realism. This is something that the Polanski version did as well, with its massively gory violence, but in terms of trying to do a realistic depiction of Macbeth, I can understand how the witches and the cultist element there might be problematic, and how you try to shift that away from such things and move it onto a more psychological level like they've done here. But even with this more realistic sort of psychological take on the character, there's a lot of stylization here, and it is beautiful, beautiful stuff. The final battle scene, for example, where the castle is lit up by the fires from the forest, is amazing stuff. The entire screen is bathed in blood red colours. There's this real feeling of hell on earth almost coming down on Scotland at this particular moment, and it gives the finale of the film a real heightened quality that's very dramatic. In terms of filmmaking, it is brilliant stuff when you take the cinematography and combine it with the ominous, almost dirge-like score and the billowing wind constantly. What this version really gets right is the mood of the play. This very dark, very grim and bleak mood, all this pathetic fallacy going on in the landscapes and everything. It looks and feels like it should. However, if you're not familiar with the play, I'm not sure this is a good place to step on. I have a couple of reasons for this. Now, first of all, I think those changes made to the start of the film will be interesting with those who are already familiar with the text, but I think if you're stepping on for the first time here, those might affect your readings in future versions if you wanted to go and read the text. But also, this version of Macbeth, I think, is in no way definitive. It's a brilliant version of the tale in its own way, but at the same time I wouldn't call it definitive because of those reinterpretations, but also because it has a lot of the play missing. It's very much more about the visual telling of the tale, I felt, more than the language. Now, credit where credit's due. The dialogue that is retained in this particular version is the original text. It has not been updated at all. And I think the delivery of the dialogue is going to be the major issue for most newcomers. Now, I've studied Macbeth and I'm relatively familiar with it, but it's been a while since I've properly read the play, and even I was having a little bit of trouble with it, because that realistic vibe that the movie is going for in a lot of senses, especially in terms of the delivery of the dialogue, where the actors are going around with accents and speaking relatively naturally, which means it's fairly mumbled and fairly coarse. That, combined with the billowing wind and the fact that the dialogue is fairly archaic in some senses, can make it very difficult to decipher. Or at least I had that in my particular screening, and I can understand why the director is trying to go for that, because it fits with the atmosphere, but at the same time you need to hear the words, and it's a bit of a struggle trying to attune your ear to the dialogue. With Shakespeare texts that are based around the original text rather than updating it, it does take a while to attune yourself to the dialogue. I think you can, if you're very much into the play, you can very much convert the language in your head, but it's difficult when you're trying to compete with these other elements. On the plus side, though, that does make you really concentrate. I was very much concentrating throughout this entire movie, trying to pay attention. Now, with that being said, I did think the performances are very solid. I mean, Michael Fassbender is a brilliant choice for Macbeth. He is a famously intense actor, and he brings a lot of that to the character, especially in the sense that he's that in this version he's already a broken man, but he's a good man to begin with. And that's sort of the arc of the play that is still retained in this particular version, in that he is a good man, he's a loyal man, but his mind isn't functioning, his brain is sort of being poisoned by these insidious thoughts, and of course he commits a terrible act, and then his guilt and suspicion keep preying upon him further. And Fassbender's performance, as he gradually unravels through the film, is very chilling. It's quite disturbing to see this loyal man sort of disintegrate before our eyes. He becomes this violent, crazed character, but he's matched by Marion Cotillard, who is a very, very solid interpretation of Lady Macbeth. And again, she is a pivotal character in this movie, because that challenge to his masculinity that provokes him to conspire to kill Duncan, again, is boldened by the additional added material, and of course it leads into Lady Macbeth's own arc, where she feels the guilt in a different way to Macbeth, where she internalises it, especially with what happens to Macduff and his family later on. And it again, those additions, while they're not purist, they very much embolden the characters in a way that you can understand why they were included. And the supporting cast is full of terrific character actors like David Thewlis, Paddy Considine, and Sean Harris, all great here. And it's really stirring stuff in its particular moments. Again, it's a very hard film to review, because I liked a lot of what it added to the text, and I liked the way it thought about the material, but at the same time, despite all that visual splendour, and I know that a lot of critics have really loved this movie, the fact that it doesn't really deal with Shakespeare on a dialogue level, which I think is the most important thing for an adaptation to do, because I think it's difficult to imagine the plays themselves on the page, and you very much need to see it in action. But if you can't get a feeling for the words in a film version, I'm not sure entirely how successful that adaptation is. But there is so much here that is very positive and very striking. It is one of the most beautiful films that I have ever seen. It's hard not to give some level of recommendation, especially because it's really powerful in terms of the effect that it had on me. After I watched the film, I felt exhausted. I almost felt like I'd been run over by a truck. And to be honest, that's exactly the sort of feeling that you should have coming out of Macbeth, out of this tale of murder and scheming and gross betrayal and just pure violence. You should feel like it's just intense. And on that level, I guess this version of Macbeth succeeds with flying colours. This latest version of Macbeth is a full-on experience. Director Justin Kurzel puts less emphasis on the text and concentrates more on the atmosphere and visuals to put across the story, in a way that will likely be quite challenging for those not familiar with the play, especially given how it's been truncated. On the other hand, it has a powerful feeling of doom and violence that makes it very effective, and the very modern reinterpretation of the story makes it still feel relevant, with Fassbender giving a menacing portrayal of the title role. After the break, Ethan Hawke finds himself terrorised by a satanic cult. Welcome back, where Ethan Hawke discovers that regression may be his only way of discovering the truth. Viewers are advised that this review contains material that some may find upsetting. Set in 1990, Detective Bruce Kenner, played by Ethan Hawke, is left mystified when John Gray, played by David Densick, walks into the police station and confesses to abusing his daughter Angela, played by Emma Watson, despite having no memory of doing so. The police consult Professor Raines, played by David Thewlis, again, who believes John has repressed his memories and that regression therapy is the best way to unlock the evidence. As their accounts start to link the Gray family to a hidden satanic cult, unfolds, Bruce starts to be watched and followed by sinister figures. Regression is helmed by Alejandro Amenabar, an acclaimed director best known for Open Your Eyes, which was remade in the US as Tom Cruise's Vanilla Sky, returned to the horror genre since The Others almost 15 years ago for a tale inspired by true events. But more on that later. Despite its lurid subject matter, Regression has an intriguing setup, especially in its earliest stages, where it takes the route of a procedural, which sets it in similar territory to last year's Deliver Us From Evil, that also looked at paranormal events from a police perspective. The crime that has supposedly occurred is so reprehensible that we want to see why it happened and those caught, especially when it's established very early on that a fellow officer, played by Aaron Ashmore, is involved, which is only the start of the Weber conspiracy that begins to unfold. A lot of this comes down to the central performance of Ethan Hawke as the obsessive detective who has clearly let his work take over his life, constantly looking over the case for absolutely anything that might have been missed and refusing to switch off. He, like us, desperately wants to connect the dots because he wants to prove himself, not least those on the force that have turned against him, and a case that even apparently the FBI have overlooked, putting him under even more pressure. It's a role that's not unfamiliar territory for the actor. There's some echoes of his writer from Sinister here, but Hawke's like-minded devotion to his role gives the film a lot of its drive as his ability to reason is tested and becomes distorted. Hawke's personal attachment to the case makes sense given Emma Watson's turn as Angela, who continues to try and challenge herself as an actress post-Harry Potter as an emotionally vulnerable victim and an innocent girl in a dark and cruel world. Watson tries very hard here, but one can't help but feel that she might be miscast given that she doesn't really convince within the background the film establishes for the character, although this would be a very difficult role for any actress to portray. The relationship between Angela and Bruce is at the core of Regression, where the latter takes it upon himself to become almost like a surrogate father figure and protector to try and heal the years of psychological abuse from within a disintegrating family, which evolves and almost reverses as the forces she warns him of begin to take hold. It's in the second half of Regression that the horror elements start to come to the surface, as superstition and suspicion become more and more the focus, and to the film's credit, when it comes to the scare scenes, they are actually disturbing. One of the best moments in Regression is a lengthy sequence where Kenneth tours the Grey household, listening to Angela's account on his tape recorder, trying to place himself in her footsteps, increasingly disturbed by what he imagines as he continues into their barn. It's a moment that's crucial to the narrative and a brilliant piece of direction from Amenabar, being so effective because of its conservation of detail, which allows the imagination to fill in the blanks as the sense of dread mounts. Like his aforementioned films, Regression very much toys with the line between fantasy and reality and makes us question what really happened to startling effect. The scenes of cultists in their black cloaks swarming around Bruce in the middle of the night are some authentic psychological frights, all photographed with a fuzzy, nightmarish quality that genuinely unsettles. While visions of sacrificing babies by white-faced ghouls borders on camp, Regression is clearly trading on familiar horror imagery for a larger purpose, however, as it's very much a tale torn between psychology and religion and how evil can use them to hide behind and give itself a greater power. Bruce starts out as a skeptic, initially shunning crosses and Bibles offered by others to try and shield himself from those that might do him harm, but he gradually becomes more and more convinced and panic-stricken, and as he becomes so, the attacks intensify. However, belief is not the same thing as fact or even evidence, and that is what the film explores, as the town falls increasingly under the grip of fear in light of the ongoing investigation. The dangers of over-devotion to religion is best embodied by David Densick as the alcoholic father, who has used his faith to fight his demons and struggles to reconcile that with what he believes he has done, but accepts his fate, believing it to be penance for the even greater sin in his eyes for destroying his family, even if that itself is not a crime. On the other hand, David Thewlis' professor is convincing in his reasoning, but seems blind to the dangers of the controversial field of regression, and that over-reliance on him is merely playing into mysticism and fear in a different way. Indeed, Kenner is not the only character who is confused by his own fixations, as many of the supporting characters are likewise so devoted to their causes that it distracts them from what the truth of the situation really is. For much of the movie I was wondering why it only had a 6% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, considering it's quite well made and had a number of effective moments. And then the ending happened and it became very clear why. The majority of Regression spends time mounting tension as things become stranger and more violent, as you keep waiting for the payoff that will tie the increasingly disparate strands together, only to walk straight into a tremendous anticlimax. To say at the conclusion is less than the sum of its parts is a severe understatement. To be fair, I knew the film was going to take a turn, since anyone who's seen a whodunit knows nothing is quite what it appears, and subtlety is not the film's strong point, but this isn't so much pulling the rug out from under the audience as tripping over it and bumping its head. Without giving anything away, and believe me that has been very difficult considering how much it annoyed me, it's a low point where two sides of the film collide with disastrous results. It wants to be a horror movie, but its psychoanalytical overtones means it feels too highbrow for such a thing and punishes the audience for enjoying the former. I've not seen an ending so violently derail a film since fellow Spanish director Rodrigo Cortés's Red Lights, but whereas that film had an ending that was bewilderingly crazy, the finale in Regression is almost unbelievably underwhelming and lands with a resounding thud. Worse, it makes major portions of the narrative completely irrelevant and taints your opinion of the entire film because of it, not least the titch the regression therapy itself that seemed to be sidelined once the cult elements started getting involved. At best, it suggests the movie has been massively misaligned. The situation it presents is not without merit, but this would merely be the middle of the story, not the end of it, and the film should have handled it as a drama rather than a horror thriller. It even exacerbates earlier issues and makes them more glaring with hindsight, namely the exploitive nature of the story itself, and the way the film handles those subjects borders on being very insensitive. The film tries to get around this by pointing to its true story origins, but that falls apart because the entire storyline has been invented, merely loosely inspired by a cultural phenomenon in the US at the time the film is set, so why invent elements that would be so distasteful? By the time the film lays its final insult with its closing title cards, it almost encourages viewers to throw things at the screen. Ethan Hawke's previous film Good Kill had a very misguided ending, but that has nothing on Regression, which will have to rank as one of the worst endings to any film released this year. Regression is a colossal disappointment, and yet for so much of its running time, it didn't appear that way. It's a well-made, if extremely grim horror thriller that manages to blend both genres to solid effect, especially when it plays with conventions and reality, with Ethan Hawke giving an excellent performance in the lead role, and Emma Watson continuing to cast off her Harry Potter persona. But the film has an ending so terrible and so exasperating that I simply cannot recommend viewers waste their time with it, wrapping itself up with a reveal that's delivered with an infuriatingly apathetic shrug. On the next episode, it's Bond. James Bond. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.